The Sprint Backlog is a forecast created by the developers in order to meet the sprint goal. It is owned by them. Nobody, not the product owner nor the Scrum Master, can make any changes to the Sprint Backlog. Notice that I use the word forecast. The plan itself, i.e. the product backlog items, is simply a forecast that the developers think they need to complete in order to achieve the sprint goal. They do not commit to individual product backlog items. The commitment of the Sprint Backlog is the single sprint goal, collaboratively defined in the sprint planning event. This is important because during the sprint planning event where the Sprint Backlog is created, we are precisely at the point in the sprint where the least is known. Therefore, we set a hypothesis, a question, a potential value to be delivered in the form of the sprint goal that is committed to, but the developers don't commit as to how that will be achieved. Therefore, the developers make informed predictions about what is needed in the form of the Sprint Backlog, but as they learn more throughout the sprint, throughout daily scrums, throughout optional refinement or feedback, they will adapt their Sprint Backlog as necessary to make it more likely that they will meet the sprint goal. So far, I know I've referred to the Sprint Backlog as the plan created by the developers to meet the sprint goal. However, it isn't just that. The Sprint Backlog is the collective parts of the sprint goal itself, the product backlog items forecast to be needed, and the plan for how the developers intend to turn those product backlog items into a done increment. That's important, and it's important to stakeholders and everyone that communicates with the developers that they understand the plan can change. When this happens, it is the accountability of the developers to make the changes transparent. Now, earlier in this video, I mentioned that the only people that can change the Sprint Backlog are the developers, and this is true. However, the developers may attempt to influence the product owner to change the product backlog based on their observations. The product owner may therefore attempt to influence the developers to change their Sprint Backlog based on their observations. The important part is that the developers don't have to change anything. The primary single focus of the sprint is the sprint goal. It is the coherence that the developers have committed to and work to achieve. Let's take a pause and try something out. I want you to set yourself a sprint goal to plan a romantic day out for your partner. I want you to imagine that the sprint goal is this: my partner will have a romantic day out that makes them happy. I know this sounds really simple, but I want you to try and write down a few independent product backlog items that may be needed to achieve that sprint goal of my partner will have a romantic day out that makes them happy. Pause the video now and give that a go. What you will find through the activity are a few things. The first of which is that there will be different ways to achieve that sprint goal, but still achieve the same outcome of making your partner happy. I would imagine you may have included in your sprint backlog product backlog items such as arrange a location for lunch, buy a gift, reserve a hotel in a picturesque location. All of those are perfectly valid product backlog items. I would be very surprised though if you came up with exactly the same as me. And that's exactly the point of a sprint goal. The developers understand the value requested by the product owner, making the partner happy, but it creates flexibility in how they can achieve the goal. Finally, the sprint goal can be measured to have been met or not been met. In our overly simplified exercise, you could simply ask your partner at the end of the day whether or not they're happy. If they are, sprint goal met. What we're trying to do by having a sprint goal is avoid the developers fragmenting into working on different initiatives. We want them to work together. As the sprint goal is the commitment of the sprint, it may mean that the developers need to self-manage and reallocate themselves during the sprint if the sprint goal looks like it's in danger of not being met. There's almost a hidden piece of information there, and that is that not everything that enters a sprint backlog needs to contribute towards the sprint goal. There is the reality that sometimes small pieces of work just need to be completed. Perhaps you need to write a single document to help with advertising. Perhaps you notice a spelling mistake on your website or on your logo. Those two things aren't large enough to take the place of a whole sprint goal, but they are important nonetheless. The important thing is that the sprint goal is the next tactical step towards the product goal. Avoid your sprint backlog being piecemeal. You're trying to create the flexibility and space through the sprint goal to allow the developer's creativity to collaborate against something. The majority of them should be working on the sprint goal. As the sprint progresses, it is not uncommon for developers to have learned something that means the work turns out to be different than expected. In this case, they collaborate with the product owner to determine how to adapt the scope of the sprint without impacting the sprint goal. Notice that the sprint goal does not change. This adaptation and collaboration with the product owner is perhaps more common when critical work emerges during a sprint. In a technical environment, this may be support queries or major incidents. In these cases, the sprint goal remains intact, but there is a collaboration on scope of the product backlog. The one final thing to mention here about the sprint backlog and the sprint goal is what happens when the sprint goal becomes obsolete. By this, I mean it's not worth progressing the sprint to achieve it any longer. An example of this might be a significant market shift that means your sprint goal is no longer relevant. In this example, solely at the product owner's discretion, the sprint is cancelled. This is very rare and is a hugely disruptive occurrence, but it does happen. When that happens, the Scrum team immediately move into sprint planning and restart the sprint with a new sprint goal. The key takeaways from this module are firstly the sprint backlog, the combination of the sprint goal, product backlog items, and plan for how to turn them into the increment is owned by the developers. Secondly, whilst the developers commit to achieving the sprint goal, they don't commit to individual product backlog items, because at the start of the sprint, they don't know of any impediments that they may encounter, so they need to adapt as needed. And finally, there is one sprint goal per sprint. It creates the focus and coherence for the Scrum team, particularly the developers, and shows them respect by not changing what they are working towards. The goalposts remain the same throughout the sprint.